2000. We are at the Atlanta History Center on this Memorial Day weekend. Our interview this morning is with Mr. Donald, or Don Pardue, who was with the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam. I want to spend a few moments talking about his experience. And let me go ahead and say thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Alan.
If you would, just begin by telling me where you lived and your occupation prior to your military service.
Yes, as a young man, I moved with my parents to Atlanta, Georgia in 1960. And I was at that time finishing up my 8th grade year of school. Continued to graduate through high school here in the North Atlanta area. And after high school graduation, from the Dunwoody area of North Metro, I went off to college. For the next couple of years, perhaps 2.5 years, I would work a quarter and go to school a quarter. That was because my father, after the first year of college, didn't like my grades, and so I was on my own. Therefore, I had to finance the remainder of my undergraduate commitment. In any event, in one of those off quarters of working and not being in school, I was drafted. And that was on July the 4th of 1967.
And then just giving a brief outline of your military career. I'm sure you moved around different locations for training and before you got sent overseas.
Yes, when I was drafted there in the summer of the mid-60s, my first duty station was Fort Benning. And at that basic training part of my military career, I had qualified for officer candidate school. After we had graduated from basic training, we went on to advanced infantry training in Fort McClellan, Alabama, not too far from Georgia, from Atlanta. And after completing the infantry training there, I was then sent back to Fort Benning, Georgia, to begin officer candidate school. And at that point, that training commitment was approximately 6 months. After completing the OCS, as we referred to it, Officer Candidate School, I had volunteered and was accepted into Ranger training. As a second lieutenant, I took about a week off before beginning Ranger training, which was about a 9-week program. And after graduating, which was also at Fort Benning, after graduating from Ranger School, or Black Berets as we're sometimes referred to, I was then, although I had volunteered to go to jump school, at that time the government, the Army, did not have plans for me to be airborne. They wanted me to be a ground commander. So the jump school was never afforded to me after Ranger School, but that was fine. I went from Fort Benning to Fort Hood, Texas.
You finally got out of the Georgia area.
Finally got out of the southeast, and took my first command as a mechanized infantry platoon leader. The mechanized element was not part of my core training because what I had been training for quite a while at this point was just straight infantry environment. However, the mechanized portion or component, I guess, still included infantry tactics. And I was promoted from platoon leader to company executive officer at Fort Hood. And this was with the 2nd Armored Division. From that point, after serving as a platoon leader and as a company exec, I then got my orders to go to Panama City, Panama, where I went through what it was known then as the Jungle Expert School. And it was more of a refresher course, similar to, not as intense as Rangers, but in the same pattern, about a 2-week combination of navigation, survival, tactics, etc. in Central America, which got myself and my other fellow junior officers who had volunteered and were accepted to this extra school, if you will, to get us climatized into what we were about to enter, that is Southeast Asia. Because of the latitude of Panama and the latitude of Southeast Asia, more particularly South Vietnam, the temperature, humidity, terrain, vegetation, etc., was extremely similar to what we were going to be faced in the war. It is my understanding that that particular school, which was Fort Gulick, has now been closed. And I think, as most everyone knows, our commitment in Panama militarily no longer exists. We do not shepherd or control the Panama Canal Zone, but in the 60s, and I think through the 70s and maybe part of the 80s, we had a very big contingency, a military contingency there, and the Jungle Survival School was part of that a lot of Vietnam officers, well, not a lot, some of us got the opportunity to get retooled on what we had been trained for and what to expect when we entered the Vietnam theater.
It sounds like that's a good preparation for what we're doing.
It was an excellent, sobering lesson and training for us. Yes, because we were all garrison troops prior to this as young lieutenants. Now we were back in the jungle, operating like we had been trained, particularly with the Rangers. And yes, it was it's a program that I would recommend that we should somehow keep forever.
So how long was it before you actually went over, from that point, went over to Vietnam?
Immediately. We were allowed to come home, I think, for about 24 hours to just slightly rest. We were somewhat fatigued after that training. But then we were on orders. Actually, when we left Panama City, Panama, we were on orders to Long Binh, South Vietnam, with a simple interim stop at our home of record, just to take some things, some personal things with us that we would have to keep during our tour. So it was the mission was to leave Central America and go immediately into the war environment while we were still fresh.
So when did you arrive in Vietnam?
I arrived in Vietnam in the summer, June of 1968. And at that point, I was still a second lieutenant. I didn't make first lieutenant until the following month, as I recall.
And what was your age at this time?
I was 20, when I entered Vietnam, let's see, I would have been 22 years old.
Do you remember any particular thoughts or emotions upon your arrival? Anticipations or anything?
The training in Central America allowed me, I should say, to accept the extreme heat when they opened the door of the airplane. Unlike most of the other people on the plane. There were probably only just a handful of us, if that had the Panama experience. To me, it wasn't overwhelming or as shocking as it was to those other young men, most of which were 18 to 20 years old, maybe 21. that overwhelming humidity and heat. So it was, and plus the fact of my Ranger training and OCS and everything else, that gave me a tremendous advantage that a lot of the other folks, sadly enough, didn't have. So it wasn't a traumatic mental shock to me as much as it might have been to others that hadn't had the opportunity to train as much as I had.
And you were in Vietnam for how long?
I was in command. It's November Platoon, Delta Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division. I had that command for approximately 2 months as an infantry platoon leader. Our mission at that point was to search and it was termed then as search and destroy. What it meant, perhaps in layman terms, might more accurately be depicted as saying identify, locate the enemy, and engage. The primary mission of the 1st Infantry Division, which entered Vietnam in 1965 and departed in 1970 from Fort Riley, Kansas, they had a 5-year commitment, and they were the first regular division to enter Vietnam of any size. That has been the history of the 1st Infantry Division since they were formed many, many decades prior to this. In any event, our primary function was to quell the constant infiltration of the North Vietnamese Regular Army, which was extremely well-equipped, highly disciplined, intelligent, and very, very motivated. Their mission was to come down through Cambodia and cross over the river into southern Vietnam with one and only one objective in mind, and that was to topple Saigon, the then capital of South Vietnam. They eventually did that, as we all know, as history has recorded, in the late spring of 1975. However, in the summer of 1968, which was probably the height of the war in terms of activity, casualties, fatalities, etc., that was the year of Tet. Their function to come down through Cambodia in a semi-secured arrangement, marshal at the river, and then come across was a constant threat to the country. And therefore, the 1st Infantry Division, and of course more particularly my company, and therefore my platoon, which I was in command of, was to daily search out for the North Vietnamese regulars. Now, in the interim of making contact with them, we would run into, very periodically, the Viet Cong in small groups. Their function was to just disrupt our major focus to identify, engage, and eliminate the regular forces from the north.
It's really hard to say what a typical day was like for you.
No, a typical day would start on the equator. You have a very fast sunrise and you have a very fast sunset. They're both early. So about 5 o'clock, we would typically be setting up in what is called a temporary perimeter, a night defensive position, another term that was used. This would typically be a company level, 3 platoons, sometimes 2 companies, but mostly just 1 company, with 3 rifle platoons and a headquarters element. This was generally composed of about 100 men. It was supposed to be twice that. My table organization and equipment for a rifle platoon was 43 men. One officer, 5 or 6 sergeants, and the rest enlisted men. What it worked out to be in 1968 in most infantry units was about half that. On a good day, I would have 23 men instead of 43 men. Some days we would go to the field with only about 19 men. The morning would start, and we would, as a lieutenant, myself and the other 2 platoon leaders, and occasionally an artillery forward observer, would all meet with a captain who was the company commander, and this would be about 6 in the morning now as the men are having sea ration, breakfast, or whatever. We would get our orders that day. The captain would assign which platoon would be scouts out. Scouts out was always the lead platoon. That's the platoon that would rotate every 3rd time because there were 3 rifle platoons. Nobody wanted to be on the front because the front was always the most vulnerable. But somebody had to walk the front element, and he would tell us, fine, at that time, November 6th, for example, it is your rotation to walk point for this day's mission, and he would then give us grid coordinates, azimuth headings, if you will, a direction of march with we did have excellent maps that I think that the French probably had, prior to us, had designed, all in metric system, but very good in topography. And we would have these in plastic bags so that when it would rain on us during the day, the maps would still stay intact. Anyway, if it was my turn to be the lead element, it was very important that I stayed on the vectors, on the headings of those compasses that we had, and try to seek out the enemy. And the terrain ranged anywhere from open fields to rice paddies to very, very intense jungle, many times of which we would have to crawl on our stomachs with our equipment to get through a certain area, sometimes several hours. With 70 pounds of equipment on our back in the configuration of a rucksack, it made it tough. What made it harder also was the fact that we stayed pretty fatigued most of the time. Our typical week would be a 6-day on and 1 day off. The 1 day off, we would take our Huey helicopters, slicks as we referred to them, go back to our permanent base camp where we could take a shower, have a great hot meal. Us officers would go to the officers club, which would be a converted house typically, usually of an old French rubber plantation baron that was in fair condition. And my enlisted men could go to their little club areas, have beers, hot meals, as I said, candy, etc. We were afforded that for 24 hours. Then we would get back on the helicopters and be injected into another mission and be out for 6 days. So we would be on 6 and off 1. Now our off day, we did have to man the perimeter, so we couldn't really get a full night's rest there, but it was still better than being in the field.
And let me just ask a couple questions, and maybe you can come back Sunday and we can spend more time if it works out, because I know you have to have an engagement just down another part of the history from here. What would you say was the hardest part, either physically or mentally, in these day-to-day operations that you're carrying out?
The lack of proper rest was always a problem with all of us. That being that at night, 50% of my command had to stay awake. And this was after an extremely long day, and sometimes after a firefight, sometimes after casualties, which in my case, I had 3 fatalities, 8 wounded in my 2 months of command on the border. We had another problem with friendly fire. the South Vietnamese Regular Army, which were our allies, would sometimes get their communications incorrect on our area of operation. One particular evening, the South Vietnamese opened up on my men. Not knowing what was going on, we returned fire and were actually fighting our own people. That didn't happen often, but occasionally it did. Obviously, the South Vietnamese looked exactly like the Viet Cong and very much like the North Vietnamese. Distinction of the enemy was a daily, an hourly problem. When I would go into villages to see if we had sympathizers with either the VC or the NVA, it was very, very difficult for me as a lieutenant to try to decipher if the chieftain of that village was in fact on our side or was on the opposing side. So we had that problem. Probably the worst days of command for any of us infantry officers were the rubber plantations. This is where the Michelin Tire Company, for many, many decades prior to our involvement, our injection into South Vietnam, had set up their plantations and had become very successful at rubber production. And when we would get into the rubber plantations, there was a triple canopy. A triple canopy is simply a layer of leaves and very intense shrubbery 3 times. What that meant was if I ran into trouble, I was denied indirect mortar support, I was denied artillery support, I was denied fixed wing jet close air support, and I was denied Huey or Cobra helicopter support. All of those were no longer in my arsenal because of that heavy canopy, and they couldn't see or fire down to give us support.
That brother narrowed it down.
It narrowed it down, so we were on our own, and that's where I got shot, was in the rubber. And that's where we took, my unit took many, many casualties. So the rubber, although it was extremely visually appealing and very cool, and the ground was flat, the romance of that quickly diminished as soon as we became under attack. And so that's where we took our highest casualties, was in the rubber plantations proper, I should say, because all of our other elements were denied because of this intense vegetation.
I know you think experience like that you can't forget. Is there any way you can put it behind you to any degree?
Yes, and I think we have done that here. For an example, at the History Center, we have put up our 14th memorial. It's a memorial dedication that we do every year. It is sponsored by the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, which I co-founded in 1981 with a handful of other Vietnam veterans. And we honor other Atlantans that have perished in the war. And this particular week here, the Atlanta History Center was kind enough to let us put our 14th bronze plaque, which is out in front of the facility here, and will be perpetually maintained. When we do that, that brings us full circle of what we accomplished or tried to accomplish, and the cost of those missions that we daily were forced or were asked or were willing to perform for this country. As long as we can have these memorials, particularly in this town, in Atlanta, once a year, it makes a very positive remembrance of what, as young men, of what was a very horrific environment. Not to mention always the memory of the lost and seriously wounded men under our command.
You mentioned coming full circle. You hear about Vietnam then and now. You hear a lot about of the negatives and the war protests and the anti-war movement. But I think the general public too has kind of come around to a point where, and you can tell me if you've seen this, I think most people appreciate the sacrifice that so many made, the devotion of duty. And I think things like the memorial and wall that's here now, I think that just falls right into line and furthers that sense. And you know, you may disagree with me, but it just, from the folks I talk to, it seems like there's a overall a deep sense of appreciation for the service of the American servicemen over in Southeast Asia.
Yes, Alan, I agree with that. That was not the case, as you may know, in the late 60s and probably throughout the 70s. I don't think that the appreciation really began until perhaps the mid 80s, the latter part of the 80s, and then throughout the 90s. I think a lot of the citizens in this country realized that we did as much as we could politically. Washington kept us from being victorious, in my opinion. But we did what we were supposed to do, given the finite guidelines that we were shackled with. And I think that there is now finally a collective thinking that, well, maybe those guys maybe they were following their orders and they were patriotic to this country and to the thought of freedom.
I know you have to get down here quick, so I'll take those microphones off of you.